All right, let's start like we always do by acknowledging our veterans who are with us. All of our veterans, raise your hand, raise your hand. There's a bunch of them here tonight. Wow. So only just because I'm curious, World War II veterans. I'm just doing a little thing here. Let's see. So there's okay. So I'm just trying to figure out the most recent veterans that we have here. So Korean War veterans, I can tell by blue vests and by, okay. Well, you don't have to clap after everyone. I'm just taking a little science. Oh, yes, you do. Okay, all right. What would come after that? How about Vietnam veterans? Several. And then, so I'll just lump together post-Vietnam, like first Gulf War or IEF or no? Any Iraqi or Afghani veterans? No. Okay, so Vietnam is as close as we are. They're still fighting. Lots of them are. Well, thank you for your service, and thanks for being here tonight. Appreciate that. A reminder again, we're videotaping the class tonight because Alex is so damn handsome. So we're, if you can't be on videotape, now's your chance to escape for other places, all right? All right, couple of notes here before we begin. I'm sure most of you saw the article this week that the last World War I veteran in America passed away this last week. Frank Buckles, who was 106 years old, 110 years old. I talked to him when he was 106, which is why I'm stuck on 106. I talked to him, and we tried to set up an interview for him at KEZW. True story. We talked to his daughter who was living with him. You know, normally when I talk to veterans' daughters, the daughters aren't 80, right? But when you're 106, your daughter's not a spring chicken. So we talked to his daughter for a while, and we were trying to get Frank all lined up to be on the morning show and talk to him, but I have this real issue personally with putting veterans in what I think are unfavorable conditions. I hate when they struggle with memory. I hate when they struggle with, I don't want our collective memory of them to be like Kirk Douglas at the Oscars, right? Which, I mean, God bless him, he did fine, but that probably, if I was in charge of the Oscars, that wouldn't have happened because I would be uncomfortable with that. So Frank, he was better than James Franco. Yes, he was. But anyway, Frank at 106 was still fairly clear of mind, but his speech was a little slowed. So I didn't want to put him in that position, and his daughter was concerned about how it would be on the phone line. And she said, besides, there's another problem here. And I said, and what's that? She said, well, about the time your show's on, he's out working on the farm. So that morning when a 106-year-old guy was out driving the tractor, there was Frank. So I never got to interview him on the air, but 110 years old, and there goes our last witness, our last personal connection with World War I, which again emphasizes why what we do here is so important. Because now the World War II veterans will take center stage, and we'll watch as their numbers continue to decline. I think I told you this before, now under 2 million, and within 4 years there will be about 500,000, because we're reaching that point where it accelerates because of age. So tonight we're fortunate to have a guy here who has made his most recent life's work, in addition to snowboarding. You do snowboard, don't you? Little bit. Cross country, that's right. In addition to that, Alex has become quite well known for his histories, and I don't have them all there, I just have several of them, of World War II. I wrote author and storyteller because I prefer to tell people that Alex is a storyteller. Author implies authoritarian, implies those stodgy old history books that had lots of statistics and lots of numbers and are accurate. Alex's books our stories, and he tells them from that perspective of the men and women who fought day in and day out, and as a good storyteller. So that's how I view what he does. So Alex and I are going to sit up. Come on up here. Say hi to Alex Kershaw, everybody. So, who came? Yeah, where do you live now? In where? Hold the microphone up. Why? Oh, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah.
Good.
Massachusetts?
Yeah.
Near Boston?
No, as far from Boston as you can possibly get, which is it's on the Vermont-Massachusetts border.
Okay.
Williamstown. Have you heard of Williams College?
Yeah.
That's the place.
Okay.
How long have I lived there? Why is a limey sitting here?
No. I'll get to all that in a little bit. Why is a limey? Now, see, I wouldn't have called you a limey.
Well, apparently I'm an Anglo-American.
Really?
I was described as that recently, yeah.
Anglo-American?
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I like, actually. I do like that.
Put that on your business card.
Yep.
Alex Kershaw, Anglo-American. Your first, you obviously, people can tell by the accent, born in England. How long did you live? When did you leave England?
I left when I was 28. I met my wife in London. I was a journalist. I lived in London. I worked for The Guardian, Sunday Times, The Times.
Yeah.
And my wife worked in publishing. And the first story I ever wrote about the Second World War was about the activities of German housewives during the Second World War, the German domestic front during the Second World War. And she was my editor.
Okay.
And the story took a very long time to write. It had to be edited many times. I don't think it was even published, you know. But, anyway, that's how I met my wife. And she was from Minnesota. She'd left America when she was 20, wanted to come back to the States. And I'd been to the States several times as a journalist and loved it. So I said, yep, I'll come with you. And it's 20 years later, I'm here.
So do you have dual citizenship? Or?
No.
No?
I'm a resident permanent alien, which means I pay taxes here, but I can't vote yet.
Are you going to do something about that?
I might do. I don't know. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I don't think I could go back and live in England right now. I feel too distanced from it, to be honest.
Do you have family there still?
Yeah. Two sisters and both my parents live there. And as a point of interest, I'm a quadruplet.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. It's the most interesting thing about me.
All right. So are you?
I mean that. That's true.
So are you 1, 2, 3, or 4?
I came second. My identical twin brother, I'm a split egg. So my identical twin brother died in birth.
Okay.
And my two sisters, who are separate eggs, they both survived. So 3 eggs, multiple birth is, for those of you who know your biology, is pretty amazing. So
I'll have to take your word for it.
But that explains the fact that half of me's not really here. You know, I'm sort of psychologically
because you're only half an egg.
Basically.
All right, this has taken a turn none of us expected, hasn't it?
Just stick to the war. Yeah.
So in London, you were already writing a little bit about the war, I mean, with German housewives, and so you were dabbling in it.
Yeah, I became fascinated when I was a kid. Both my grandfathers served in the Second World War. One of them had a great war. He was in the RAF, and his job was to go out into the desert in Egypt and rescue downed Spitfires. And he would deal with local Bedouin tribes who would take him out with camels, and they would salvage parts from Spitfires. And because of his connection with the Bedouin and the local connection, he did very well in the black market. So extremely well. He couldn't bring the profits back to the UK to Britain after the war. But he had a good war. It was he always talked about it at great length. And my other grandfather, who's actually my mother's father, was killed before my mother was born.
Okay.
And he was in the Royal Navy. He was a telegraphist, a local journalist, and he was on what were called the Malta convoy runs, which were British convoys that were sent to try and relieve Malta in the Mediterranean. And the only way that this island could remain free and the people could eat, basically, was to be relieved by the Royal Navy, by these convoys. And the losses were immense. They were huge. The German U-boats picked them off like flies. My grandfather's boat was hit by a U-boat, a torpedo, sunk. He went into the water. He was picked up, put onto a second boat. That boat was sunk. He went into the water the second time, and he was badly injured, and he got gangrene. He was taken to Malta and then brought back to England. My grandmother was pregnant with my mum at the time, and his leg was chopped off at his knee first, and then secondly at the hip. It didn't do any good, and he died, I think, 3 months before my mum was born. Mm-hmm. So I grew up always very aware of the cost of the Second World War, and certainly the cost, and I would have to say honestly, throughout my mum's life, she was definitely damaged by it.
How many of you have, not to embarrass anybody or anything, but how many of you have read Alex's books, or at least part of them, or stories from them? It's about half the folks that are here. So the rest of you will have order forms in the lobby with your coffee this afternoon or this evening when you go out for your drinks, because you're really missing something if you've not. This is my personal, and Alex knows I'm a big fan of his work. We've known each other a long time now and have been on the radio together and at things together. If you're really taken with this history enough to the point where you come and sit in this classroom and enjoy the interviews that you hear here, you will definitely enjoy all of these titles, and Capra, and I probably missed one other one too. I didn't miss it, just didn't put it up there because I thought this would be our theme. Did I get the Few and The Longest Winter in the wrong order? Did I do the order?
No, that's the right order.
Okay.
Yep.
So, Bedford Boys. Now, when you write Bedford Boys, you've already been published, so you're familiar a little bit with the ins and outs of that side of this whole thing. Somebody somewhere tells you a story, somebody says something, you see a news article. How does Bedford Boys come to you?
Well, I spent about 10 years as first of all, can I say that I'm also a huge fan of yours, Rick?
You could say that.
Particularly, but I'm also very grateful to Regis. I won't go on too long, but two of my books, Escape from the Deep, the central character in that book was a guy called Clay Decker. And had it not been for the Regis interview, Dan, did you do that one with Clay Decker? Yeah. I wouldn't have had the insight into his character. I wouldn't have been able to have the richness that I gained. And I'm working on a book right now called 500 Days, which I'm absolutely obsessed by. I'm right in the middle of it. And Dan, again, interviewed the key character, the central hero of that book, a guy called Felix Sparks, who you knew very well too. And we can talk about that a little bit later on, but Regis is a unique place. I've never been anywhere else where students and veterans and the general public are put together, and where the product of that is so positive and so productive. I think it's unique and it's great. So that's my little spiel. But you're very lucky. You're very lucky to have this. Thank you. Anyway.
You're welcome.
But anyway, to answer the question,
that part.
I was a freelance journalist for about 10 years, and I covered a lot of stories around the States, and I worked as a features writer, not a news reporter, and that meant I was writing magazine articles, and the photography was very, very important. So I worked with 3 or 4 guys for about 10 years, and their hero, the guy they worshipped, was a guy called Robert Capa, who was the greatest, indisputably the greatest combat photographer of the Second World War. Some people would say of all time. And I wrote a biography of him, and his great story, the story that made his name, was D-Day and Omaha Beach. He was the only photographer, civilian photographer, that went in with the first wave on Omaha Beach, and spent actually an hour and a half on the beach. Most of the people around him were killed, and then waded unbelievably back out to a landing craft. And his pictures were shown, and they were the first images that any Americans saw of what I would call America's finest hour, which was June the 6th, 1944. The first images were seen 2 weeks later in Life magazine, and they were Kappa's photographs of Omaha Beach. So I had to go to Omaha Beach because that was his great story, and I had to see the beach. And when I was there, I was walking along the beach, and I came across a memorial, and it was a National Guard memorial, which is very close to the sands. There are many memorials on Omaha Beach, but there's only one that's right next to the sand, and that's the National Guard memorial. Not many people understand that there were two divisions that landed on Omaha Beach, the 1st Division and the 29th Division. And the 29th Division was a National Guard outfit. So these were literally weekend warriors from the 1930s, farm boys. And there's a National Guard memorial there to signify their sacrifice. So I became fascinated by the idea that what the hell were the National Guard doing as assault troops in the most critical amphibious operation of the Second World War, arguably, although people in the Pacific veterans from the Pacific would probably argue against that. Or, in fact, Sicily, where more men were actually landed on D-Day than Normandy. So while I was there, I started talking to some veterans, and I went on June the 6th. I think it was 2001 I went.
Yep.
And I went at 6:32 a.m. to the very spot, Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach, and I met a couple of veterans. I talked to them, and they told me the story about Bedford, small town in Virginia, 3,000 people in 1944, and Company A of the 29th of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Infantry Division. 34 of the men in that company of 200 actually came from Bedford. They'd all joined the National Guard in the late 1930s, and they were still in, unbelievably, Company A on D-Day, five years later. And of those 34, 19 were killed in perhaps 5-10 minutes. So I was absolutely stunned by the story. I found it really fascinating and appealing, and I decided that what I would try and do was to tell the story of D-Day, but do it through the eyes of a community. Not just the men who were killed and fought that day, but the wives, the mothers. In one case, the daughter who never saw her father, a woman called Danny Parker. And I thought it would be a good way of telling a story of how the immense violence that so many men and so many companies of men endured during the Second World War, how that violence was repeated back home, and how war doesn't just stop when the firing ends and didn't just stay in Europe. It did come back to many communities all across America in a devastating way.
Bedford being such a small town, that having such, I mean, literally every family there was affected.
Everybody knew someone that had been lost. And I interviewed 12 men who landed in the first waves on Omaha Beach. The last one died last year, actually. A guy called Ray Nance, who was a lieutenant. He was the only officer from Bedford who came home, and he became a postman. And so here you have this guy, he's 23 years old, and he's delivering letters to all the families whose sons didn't come home. And they're thinking, what the hell are you doing here? You were supposed to be their officer. Why are you alive? And why is my son dead? So he lived with that for the rest of his life. I think he was 88 when he died. And he had a New York Times obituary, which was great.
He used to go to the memorial, right?
Yeah.
And sit and would talk with people who would come out and.
Yeah. So it was great for several reasons. Number one, I got to interview a lot of veterans while they were still alive that had been on Omaha Beach at its most violent, and could tell you what it was like and could remember it really, really well. And I also got to interview their relatives and their families, and had an insight into a small town in America that went to war and made the ultimate sacrifice on D-Day anyway.
The National D-Day Memorial is there in Bedford now. If some of you have probably been there to see it, if not, and you're ever in Virginia, take the drive down to see it. It is absolutely breathtaking.
Yeah, and a better place for you to go if you haven't been there already. I don't mean to say this in the wrong way. I'd say that you should all make a pilgrimage if you are interested in this period of history, and if you want to feel proud to be Americans, is you should go to Omaha Beach, and you should go to the graveyard above that beach. There are 9,300 white crosses that all face one way, west towards home, and those are the Americans that died in the battle for Normandy. Those are the Americans whose bodies could be found. There are 11 of those crosses belonging to Bedford boys.
Yeah.
I think until I went to that graveyard, until I did this story about Bedford, I didn't really feel emotionally tied to the country. My wife, my son's an American, who was born in America. Now it's been almost 18 years here, but until I went to that graveyard in France, and the soil there is permanently American. It's not French. I didn't feel a kind of visceral, emotional connection to the U.S.
You know what?
And I think that, in a way, without going on about it too much, my connection, the reason why I've written mostly about Americans, my connection is something it ignores almost all the history afterwards and before. I mean, I'm connected to America, I think, from 1939 to 1945, you know.
The first time I went to Normandy, because I've been there 4 times, and the first time I went and did the radio show from there, what struck me was, I think it was the first time I realized the sacrifice of the generation, and it was where I felt a sense of how indebted I was for that sacrifice. I think that was my take when I was there. Again, when you see those 9,347, however many that there are that are just laid out forever and really right to the cliff and to the channel. It's
right. No, I was in California last week, and I actually was invited there by the History Channel because they're doing a program called The Second World War in 3D.
Yeah.
And they found a lot of these photographs that the Germans took, and in fact some journalists, actually a Frenchman took, in one instance, and you put these special specs on, and you buy the TV in a year or so, and you'll be able to see the Second World War in 3D. Anyway, I was absolutely mesmerized, really struck by one photograph, and it's in the outskirts of Paris, in a suburb, on a very hot, sticky August day in 1944. And you look at a Jeep, and there's 3 GIs in the Jeep, and the radio aerials are sticking out at you. In the 3D picture, they're sort of hitting you in the face almost. And local French, 2 or 3 housewives, a couple of beautiful young French women, all dressed in immaculate white dresses, are standing around this Jeep. And there's these 19, 20, 21-year-old Americans liberating Paris. I'm an unabashed romantic about that. I think it's hard to imagine a more romantic scene than working class Americans liberating a beautiful capital of the old world. The new world goes back in all its brashness, in all its modernity, in all its lack of class consciousness, and liberates the old, comes to the rescue of the old that should know better and didn't. And I think it's if you look at the more I look at it, the more I meet veterans, the longer I spend studying the Second World War, the more profoundly I realize how little I've understood and how significant that sacrifice was and just how great a story it really is.
So what did you take from the Bedford Boys?
What did I personally take from it? I think when you're a journalist, a lot of journalists don't tend to have a terribly great sense of self-esteem.
Yes.
Apart from the egomaniacs you see on TV. Most of them, sorry. Not all of them, but I think a lot of journalists often feel that we are nosy, we ask questions that we perhaps shouldn't ask, that we are, by the very nature of our profession, we're quite exploitative. And I think for the first time when I wrote The Bedford Boys, I felt that I'd been exploitative of people's feelings and pride and asked questions that had ended up making people cry in some cases. But the net result was one that the community, not a critic, not the New York Times, not the History Channel, the community, the widows and the people that lived in the town genuinely appreciated. And I felt like I'd actually done something that was, maybe positive. It was
definitely
I felt
positive.
It definitely. I remember when the book was published, it was in the town, in front of the courtyard steps, in front of the memorial that was originally put up in 1954 to the, in all, 22 guys from Bedford that died liberating Normandy. And there were about 300 people there, and a lot of the relatives were there, daughters, sisters, brothers, some of the veterans. And it was just amazing, almost 60 years later, to actually stand there in front of people for whom this was not history. This was something that some of them still felt very, very, very powerful.
Sure.
I'll never forget, actually, the widow of there were two brothers. Actually, there were more cousins among the Bedford Boys than I could count. There were three sets of brothers, one set of twin brothers, the Stevens brothers. Mm-hmm. And of the three sets of brothers, one set, both of them were killed. And the scene in Saving Private Ryan, have you seen Saving Private Ryan? The scene where, I don't know what at one point, I think it's the end of the first act, where the camera shows you the human detritus, the personal belongings splayed out on the beach, and the Bible. That's based on the Bible. That's actually, the Bible belonged to Bedford Hoback, who was one of the Bedford Boys, and was actually found by another GI who was walking along the beach 2 days later. He picked up the Bible and looked in the front, and the home address was there. And he wrote to the family with the Bible, which they received about a month after they'd learned that their son had died. And I was shown the Bible by his sister, and the mother prized the Bible for the rest of her life, and placed it on top of the TV set in the parlor, wouldn't let it out of her sight. And that was, it struck me as a kind of an interesting story. And actually, the Bedford Boys, the original title was Where Are My Boys? But thankfully, the editor changed it to the Bedford Boys, which sounds better. But the reason why I wanted to use the title Where Are My Boys is because the mother, Macy Hoback, who'd lost her two sons on Omaha Beach, even in her 70s, would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, "Where are my boys?" So it was interesting.
It was a good education. I mean, for
Definitely,
you,
yeah.
it was a grand introduction to all sides of the veteran experience.
Definitely, yeah.
Both from
Definitely, yeah.
So we go on to, and Bedford Boys does well. New York Times bestseller?
Yeah, it just got on the list.
Yeah. Well, since you mentioned
No,
it.
anyway.
And
I feel really uncomfortable
I
sitting
know
here.
you do. I know you
You
do.
know,
Don't be
I sit in the library on my own,
uncomfortable.
tapping away. I'm sorry if I'm boring you. It's,
He's doing all right? He's telling good
The
stories.
real-
All right, they're enjoying it. It's just you and me.
No, but I always feel that the microphone should be handed around
Oh, we're going to get
at
to
the
that.
back with the real.
We'll get
the
to
real
that.
guys.
We're
But
not letting you out of here without letting
anyway.
them do some questions. So the longest winter. This was the second time I got to interview Alex, and it was right before he became a Weather Channel star. Used to crack me up. I'd flip over to see what the temperature was in Denver, and then they were doing How Weather Changed History. Right? That was the series with Jim Cantori. And then there's Alex talking about the Battle of the Bulge and the weather at the Battle of the Bulge. I thought, sweet, I want to be on the Weather Channel. How cool is that? So the longest winter tells the story of who?
The longest winter tells the story of the most decorated American small unit of the Second World War, and it's an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon that were involved that on the first day of the Battle of the Bulge, the greatest battle in American history. They were in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time, and they held up the main spearhead of the German advance for around about 18 hours, maybe 24 hours. And in holding up that main attack spearhead force, an SS force, they delayed the German attack sufficiently to allow reinforcement, other lines to regroup, and made, many historians agree, a critical difference in the first hours of the Battle of the Bulge. And some people say that their action was hugely important. But the reason why I wanted to write about that platoon was because there were many other platoons and companies and regiments that did exactly the same thing. They were told to stand and hold. They were not to retreat. They were there to fight to the bitter end. And this platoon did that, and many other platoons did that. It just happened to be the case that this platoon, 30 years later, was recognized by President Carter, and all walked out at Yankee Stadium on the first day of the season and had their names in lights and were recognized. But the impetus for the book, the reason why I wanted to write the book, was to show on a very human level the kind of spirit and courage and tenacity of American troops during the Battle of the Bulge.
Now, you mentioned that the unit was intelligence and
Reconnaissance.
but there were a lot of guys that were there that weren't that. I mean, they had done other things. A bit of a ragtag outfit, right?
It was ragtag in a sense, but it was also perceived as being quite an elite unit. INR platoons, the people selected to go into INR platoons, at that time in the war, many of them were ASTPers. They were at college. They were like you guys.
Yeah.
In fact, out of the platoon of 18 men, 11 of them, I believe, I might be wrong here, 11 of them were at college in 1942. And they hoped that they would not have to go and see combat. They were very smart, and they were hoping to see out the war by staying in college. And at the very worst, perhaps they would be drafted, or something would happen. The ASTP program would be ended, and they might end up as a technician somewhere, or in the artillery, an observer, not as a private in a foxhole facing 500 German paratroopers, and in one case, firing a machine gun until the very last round. So they were a smart bunch. They were smart cookies.
They held as long as they could, then taken prisoner. Kept together as prisoners?
Some of them were kept together. They ended up forming three groups. They went into Germany into the POW system in Germany at probably the worst time that you could go and could be a POW in Germany. December 1944, as the Third Reich was being obliterated from the air, and they were actually within 2 days of being captured, most of them were locked into a boxcar, which was strafed by typhoons. And I'm sure must be a couple of American pilots in here.
There are.
But the typhoon, to be machine gunned, to be stuck in a boxcar, not having eaten for 3 or 4 days, terrified, thirsty, packed in like sardines, and then to hear the sound of a typhoon coming in low and firing was a terrifying thing. So they were prisoners in Germany at the very worst time.
But fortunate that they were kept as prisoners and not executed on site when they were captured.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Because there was certainly during the Bulge enough of that going on.
Yeah. In fact, the Malmedy massacre occurred the day after they were captured. They were captured around 5 o'clock on the 16th of December 1944. They only saw combat I say only, but they were in combat from about 8 o'clock in the morning until 5 o'clock that day. And they fended off 4 separate full frontal German attacks, 18 men. And the estimate is that they perhaps killed between 200 and 500 Germans. The platoon commander was 20 years old at the time. He was one of the youngest ever officers in the US Army. He'd actually joined the National Guard aged 13. His parents had lied about his age. And there's a photograph in the book of him sitting there, and he's 13 years old. He's the age of my son. My son's 13, you know?
Yeah.
And so his name's Lyle Bauk. He was called Lyle Bauk Jr. And I have to say that he is, apart from Jack Hallowell, who's here. Jack, are you here?
Where's Jack? Oh, there's Jack. I didn't see Jack.
45th Infantry Division veteran who I've had lunch with today and have got to know very well. Other than Jack, there's one American veteran who I became very good friends with. I like to think so anyway.
Yeah.
And that's Lyle Bauk. He is an extraordinary guy. And he felt his father was an alcoholic. He had a very, very tough time in the 1930s during the Depression. He found a mentor in the commanding officer who chose him to lead this INR platoon. And this was his chance to shine in life. This was the way that he was going to prove that he was somebody, that he could prove that he was not the waster that his dad was. And imagine his feelings then when he's propping up a private who's bleeding all over him, walking down a hillside after 7 hours of very, very intense combat with the entire INR platoon on its first day of combat as prisoners. And he sat in a cafe in a little village called Lanzareth with his platoon. They were all captured. 3 of them were very seriously wounded. And I asked him when I interviewed him, how did you feel? And he said, well, you have to understand, I felt when you're taken prisoner, you feel like you failed. If you're an officer, you feel like you failed. I felt like I'd totally failed, that I'd got the best INR platoon in the US Army, he thought, shot up and captured. And he felt terrible about it. It really, he was haunted by it still. He told me a great story, which I'll repeat, which is that, and it sounds a bit hokey, but in the cafe, there were lots of German wounded troops too who they'd shot that day. And actually the SS commander who was given the most crucial job during the Battle of the Bulge in the first days, a guy called Jochen Piper, absolutely fascinating SS warlock. I mean, sublime Superman of a warrior. I mean, just incredibly talented practitioner of blitzkrieg. apart from Felix Sparks, there are very few so distinguished combat commanders, and Joachim Peiper belonged to the SS and was one of these guys. And he came into the cafe, and Lyle Bauch saw him talking to various German officers, and he was dressed head to toe in black leather and was screaming at the German commander who'd taken Lyle Bauch prisoner. And in German, what he was saying was, what the hell have you been doing all day? I'm delayed by 24 hours. My tanks were supposed to have pulled through here this morning. What got in the way? And the German commander says, well, there's an entire American battalion up there on the hill. In fact, there was an INR platoon of 18 guys. And Peiper says to the commander, well, how do you know? How do you know there's a battalion up there? Have you sent out scouts? Have you actually looked? And the guy's, no. So Peiper sends out scouts, and sure enough, finds that there's no one there. The only Americans that stopped this attack, the most crucial attack of the Battle of the Bulge, were Lyle Bauch and his men. And Lyle Bauch sitting there, 20 years old, looking at this conversation and just sitting, oh my God. He didn't know what it was about at the time. Later on, he discovered what had been said. Anyway, to his right is a cuckoo clock. And his aunt had said to him, if you're a layabout, you're a loser, and nothing's good ever going to happen in your life. And when he was 15. And she said, if you make it to 21, that'll be a miracle. And if you do, you'll have a fantastically prosperous life. Lyle Bauch's 21st birthday was at midnight of the 16th of December, 1944. His 21st birthday was going to be the 17th of December, 1944. And it's 10 o'clock on the 16th of December, and all he can do is look at this cuckoo clock. He's watching
counting it down.
No, he's watching the minute hand move towards it, and he's thinking about his aunt saying, if you make it to 21, everything will be fine. And he watches it, and finally the cuckoo clock, I don't think the cuckoos came out, but
right.
It touches midnight, and he said to me, I felt this immense relief. I felt this energy sort of drained out of me, the adrenaline drained from me, and I just sat down and went, F it, I don't care. He didn't care anymore. He's like, what the hell?
Yeah.
He did care, but that was his way of being able to psychologically deal with defeat, loss, and the fact that his closest friend, who was a private, and he's a lieutenant, not supposed to be that close, but they were, had most of his face shot off. What had happened at 5 o'clock that evening was that the Germans outflanked the positions of the platoon, and in several cases they actually had to thrust Schmeisser machine pistols, which were very effective at close range. It's a sort of small machine gun. And they actually thrust these pistols in and said, come out or we shoot. Or they said, we'll throw a grenade in, or you come out. And that was the only way that you get these Americans to come out of these foxholes, literally. They were using machine gun bullets in rifles. They were that determined not to give up. Their orders were, don't surrender.
Yep.
And Lyle Bauch at around 5 o'clock on the 16th of December, he looked through the front slit of his foxhole and saw some German shadows. So he got out the back, used his carbine and fired at them. And he gets back into the foxhole, and a guy called Bill James, who was 19 years old, a private, his runner, they were both sharing the same foxhole. And James says to him, did you get anything? Did you get anything? And Bauch said, yeah, I think I got a couple. A split second later, the barrel of a Schmeisser machine pistol comes through the front of the slit of the foxhole. And Bauch instinctively, if I put a gun in you, he pushed the barrel away instinctively. At that split second, the German opened up, and instead of hitting Bauch in the face, it hit James in the face. Bill James was carried down the hillside by Bauch and was sat next to him, bleeding all over him, all that night, as Bauch was looking at the cuckoo clock.
Yeah.
And Bill James had 37 operations. He survived the war. He had 37 operations to reconstruct his face, and the pain was so much that he committed suicide in 1977, a year before the platoon were officially recognized by President Carter as the most decorated of the Second World War. And Bill James had actually needled and almost harassed Bauch for about 10 years during the 1960s to try and do something to get the platoon recognized. Bill James had read 2 or 3 official US Army histories, and finally James understood the significance of what they'd done that day. They'd held up the entire pincer of they'd held up the German army in a vital way.
Most decorated unit. What kind of decorations did they end up with?
I think it's in the book, but there's I think 4 DSCs, 2 Silver Stars, and the rest of the platoon all got bronze medals.
When did Lyle first know that everybody had made it?
He didn't know that everyone had made it until he was. It's a good question. I'm trying to think when he would know that. I think he was rescued. He was actually rescued from a POW camp, and this is where the story for me became very, really great. The mentor, the father figure, who was only 26, a guy called Kreese, Major Kreese, fantastic commander. He'd chosen Bauch as his protege to lead this platoon, and Kreese discovered that in Moosburg, towards the end of April 1945, Lyle Bauch was probably about a week from dying. He was severely malnourished and had terrible jaundice. And suddenly the camp was liberated, and he went to a wire fence, and he saw a guy with a checkerboard patch on his shoulder, which is the 99th Division.
Right.
And he calls out to this guy, he said, "Hey, soldier, come over here, you know." And the soldier comes over to the wire, and he said, "Do you know Kreese? Do you know the regiment, you know this guy Kreese?" And he said, "I don't know who the hell you're talking about, soldier. You know, I'm a replacement. I don't know what you're talking about." He said, "Well, I'm a 99th Division guy too." And he took a piece of cardboard from a K ration that was, I don't know where he got it from, and he scratched onto it Lyle Bauch, INR platoon, and then he put Major Kreese. And he said, "Just take that to please take that to a headquarters or a command post, just please." And the soldier's like, "Oh, yeah, you know."
Yeah.
And he thrust his hand through the wire and grabbed the soldier, and literally the guy didn't have much strength, and said, "Will you swear with your life? You swear with your life that you'll take this message to any officer above you in 99th Division, and take this, please." And the guy said, "Oh, okay, buddy, you know, fine." And he did. 2 days later, Lyle Bauch's lying in a cot in Moosburg, very close to death, and Major Kreese turns up with a jeep full of food and other medical supplies, and picks him up and carries him and sits him in the jeep and takes him to the nearest aid post. So I thought it was amazing that this guy's father, who he saw as a father, his father figure, mentor, at the end was there to save him, and literally did save him from death. He would have, another 24 hours, he would have died.
Bedford Boys and the Longest Winter. Okay, so with each of these books now, Alex is again, as you can tell, why I say storyteller, because he's got just a great knack for finding the human aspects of these events and telling it through their eyes. Then we get to The Few, which is really different than the first 2 stories, because this is not it's about Americans, but it's not all about Americans. It's about 7 Americans specifically, who at a time when Americans are not flying in World War II, decide that they need to do something. They need to be in the fight. These 7 need to get engaged. So they join up with the RAF, or they become members of
the Royal Air Force. And everyone's sitting in the audience thinking, okay, we're 2 down, 3 to go.
No, they're not counting.
No, as a Brit, there's not a greater story. It's kind of our foundation myth in a way. Modern Britain, the Battle of Britain.
Battle of Britain.
In 1940, less than 1,000 pilots fought off the Luftwaffe, and it was the first real victory for the British in the Second World War. And this is, remember, 18 months before Pearl Harbor. And America was not just sitting on the sidelines, it was in many places vociferously neutral. There were a lot of Americans that did not want to get drawn into the Second World War. And 7 Americans who were most of them were civilian pilots, they decided that they would break their own country's laws. They would risk $10,000 fines and imprisonment and illegally cross over to Britain, contravening 2 very strict neutrality laws that were passed in the late 1930s to stop any Americans joining a warring power. And they went to Britain and they joined the Royal Air Force and they fought in the greatest aerial conflict in history, which was the Battle of Britain. Only one of them out of those 7 survived. Only one of those men lived, and they never came back. All of them. Only one of the guys that I wrote about was lucky enough to come back to the U.S. after the Battle of Britain. 2 of the 7 Americans who flew in the Battle of Britain were killed during the Battle of Britain, and all but one of the other survivors were killed in 1941, flying for what were called the Eagle Squadrons. And by late 1940, there were so many young Americans that had gone over to Britain, inspired by the example of the Royal Air Force, that the Royal Air Force was able to form a squadron made up entirely of Americans called 71 Eagle Squadron. And then they formed another 2 squadrons in 1941. And in fact, 71 Eagle Squadron, by November of 1941, a month before the US entry into the Second World War, was the highest scoring squadron in the RAF. Not a lot of British RAF historians will tell you that story, but I will. Quite remarkable when you think about it. And they were a real ragtag bunch. They were really outrageous guys. And in fact, one of the great experiences of my during the time I spent researching these books and meeting lots of veterans is that I met in Colorado Springs, which I understand isn't too far away from here.
Yes.
I met a guy called Bill Edwards 6 years ago, and he was the president of the American Eagle Squadron Association, which is an association for all the American pilots who flew in any of those 3 squadrons. And he was 85 years old, and I flew over the Rockies with him in a Cessna.
Just the 2 of you?
Just the 2 of us, yeah. And it's quite a funny story because when I got into the plane, I didn't think, this guy's a fantastic pilot. He must be great. But when I got into the plane, there's a kind of control panel on the Cessna, and Bill, Eagle pilot, couldn't find the magneto switch to start the engine, and he said, "Roll down the window, will you?" And I rolled down the window, and then he shouted out to one of his mates on the airfield. He said, "Oi, Jack, I need grab a spanner, will you? Grab a ratchet, you know?" And I was like, "Oh my God, what am I? This guy, a ratchet? What the hell?" The guy walks over, hands the ratchet to Bill, who whacks the control panel, and out of the control panel pops the magneto switch. I don't know. Anyway, it was the switch that he then turned to start the engine so that we could take off. So I was
Okay, so he's 85.
I was a little bit nervous.
Yeah, I would imagine.
But an hour and a half later, he landed, and it was. I almost couldn't feel the wheels touch the tarmac.
Yeah.
An amazing pilot, and someone that took me to a hotel in Colorado Springs, and adored England, adored Churchill.
Yeah.
Every time I met him, would always try and take me places where there was English beer, and and told me a fantastic story about how the Eagle pilots went back to England in 1977, and they had just had an audience with the Queen. I don't think they had tea with the Queen,
No doubt.
but they, Yanks don't get to do that very often. But they had an audience with the Queen, and they all felt very, they were riding high. And it was the last thing they did before they got on the bus to go back to the hotel before they left and went back to America. And Bill told me this story about how they're all sat on the bus waiting to leave, and this little old lady, 4 foot 10 inches, got onto the bus and stood at the front of the bus. And she said, I've heard about you guys, I read it in the newspaper. And she'd walked 10 miles.
Just to see these guys.
To see if she could maybe see these guys. And she said, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being with us when we needed everybody we could get. Thank you for being here and saving us.
Wow.
Saving my country.
Yeah.
You have to go back to 1940, in the summer of 1940, to realize that it came down to maybe 3 or 4 days. The Second World War would have been would have had a very different outcome. There would not have been a Britain for Americans to come to and invade France, mainland Europe from.
Yep.
D-Day wouldn't have happened.
Yep.
And think about it, summer of 1940, entire Europe under Nazi domination. What reason would the Americans have for declaring war on Hitler? None.
The one of the 7 that came back home to the States, to a warm reception when he came back home. I mean, he had violated a whole bunch of laws.
He actually was really annoyed and upset when he came back because he wasn't allowed to wear his RAF uniform. There's a guy called Art Donahue who was the... actually, Art Donahue grew up about 15 miles from where my wife grew up. And I saw it when he was a kid. I adore this guy. He's one of my great heroes. He would sit in an orange box, and he attached wooden wings to it, and he would sit in this orange box and pretend to be flying. You have to remember that in the 1920s and 30s, the idea of flight, it was like going to the moon. It was absolutely revolutionary. It was most young Americans were fascinated. They'd heard stories of, it was the golden age of flight.
Yeah.
Anyway, Art Donahue was shot down on the 10th of August 1940 and quite badly burnt, but saw about 2 weeks of very intense action in the Battle of Britain, at the height of the Battle of Britain. Became an ace eventually, shot down 5 Germans, and in March of 19 refused to join the Eagle Squadron. So they're a bunch of cowboys, and some of them were. The reason why he didn't want to join the Eagles is because he belonged to a 64 Squadron and felt that it would be a betrayal of his fellow pilots in 64 Squadron to go to another American squadron, and also felt that the Eagles needed so much training that they wouldn't see action. And that's another reason why he stayed with 64 Squadron. Anyway, he came back to St. Charles, Minnesota in March of 1941. There's a fantastic photograph in my book of him showing the tail, a part of a tail of a Messerschmitt that he'd shot down to his sister in St. Charles, Minnesota. And this is March 1941, long before Pearl Harbor. And he was very, very angry. He wrote letters to his mum and dad every day, which I saw. And he was angry that he couldn't wear his RAF uniform. And his approach, his philosophy, if you like, was that he had joined the RAF because he believed that America would eventually be drawn into the Second World War. And when he was interviewed by the BBC as part of their propaganda efforts after the Battle of Britain, he said honestly, I'd rather defeat Hitler in someone else's backyard rather than my own. And he was an ideologue. He was a real idealist. A lot of the guys that went over and joined the Eagle Squadrons were thrill seekers. They were buzz junkies. Right. Absolutely. They were obsessed with flying, and they wanted to get into the fastest plane around, which was a Spitfire. But Art Donahue wasn't. And Art Donahue was shot down as he became the first ever American squadron leader, and the only one, I think. There's never been an American that's ever led a British squadron. And he was the first, and he was shot down in October of 1942, just off the coast of France, and killed. And he was actually the last pilot also to fly out of Singapore before it fell to the Japanese. And he wrote 2 books. One was called Tally Ho, Yankee and a Spitfire, which has some of the most beautiful prose about fighter combat in an airplane that I've ever read. And then he wrote The Last Flight from Singapore, which is a story of his time in Singapore. And he was awarded the DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, by the British for an action in Singapore where he was hit by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. And the shell hit his plane and ripped a piece of his thigh about that big out of his thigh. And he had to stuff one gloved hand into his thigh, the hole in his thigh, and fly for about 40 minutes across jungle. And those pilots who've flown across jungle will tell you that if you land, you're dead because you're landing in jungle. So with one fist stuck in his leg, losing blood very, very fast, of course, he managed to fly back to an airfield and land his plane, unbelievably, with one hand, for which he was awarded the DFC. So a heck of an American, a great guy. And it made a big difference that he grew up in St. Charles, Minnesota, not far from my wife's family. And amazing. And a lot of his relatives were around. I went to Springfield, Massachusetts, after receiving a strange phone call. And the guy on the phone said, "Please come to my house. I live not far from you. I know that you live not far away. I have something I want to show to you. I'm a relative of Art Donahue." I said, "Oh, okay, great, I'll come." About 2 weeks later, I walk into the front of this home in Springfield, into the front room, and there is a trunk. And on the top of it is printed Singapore, early 1942. And I opened it, and it was every single letter he'd ever written to his parents. There were the RAF wings that had been taken from his uniform, a piece of shrapnel, a part of the Messerschmitt plane that he'd shot down, and hundreds of photographs. Great guy.
The few. All right, good place to take a break and go get some coffee and cookies and all that good stuff. Before you go, Dr. Clayton would like to share something.
He is a great storyteller, right? This is great. This is really good. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Big Hoss Restaurant sponsors our coffee breaks, and you'll see some signs up there, some menus. If you get a chance to patronize Big Hoss Restaurant up on Tennyson, please do. Very strong supporter of our Center for the Study of War Experience. We also have information on our silent auction bruncheon that the center is hosting on May 22nd. We've got some information about some of the pieces that have already been donated. Beautiful condo in Vail that has been donated by the Wallenhubs, who are here tonight. A weekend up at the Bidawile Ranch in Wyoming, dinner for 8 with Gershwin music. So there's a bunch of things that we have that I think you'd be very interested in. We're looking for more donation items. We got some sheets up there you can sign up for. It should be a wonderful, wonderful day. We're going to have, Alex is going to sign a bunch of his books that are going to be part of the silent auction too as well. So please pay attention to the information we've got on the silent auction, May 22nd. Mark it on your calendars. Should be wonderful. I know you would enjoy it. It's going to be a great day, so don't hesitate to get that information. Enjoy the coffee break. Patronize Big Hoss. We also have tickets up there for you veterans. Reduced rate for getting into a wonderful exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver, which Nathan Matlock put together. It's an exhibit by Dario Robleto, a wonderful contemporary conceptual artist. So for you veterans, ordinarily the admissions price is $10. This is for $2. And it's all about various pieces that have been constructed from artifacts of war. I think veterans will find it just absolutely fascinating. He's an internationally acclaimed artist, so take advantage of that.
So, Bedford Boys, longest winter, the few, now that you've got the list of books you want there for your upcoming birthdays and anniversaries and holiday gifts for your Kindle, for your iPads and Nooks and all that good stuff. We're going to get into the next book, and one that Regis had a real association with. Regis and Alex was kind enough to put my name up in the forward with Regis, and so for about a period of about 15 minutes, my grandkids thought I was the coolest guy in the world because my name was in a real book. It was like, wow, look at that's Poppy's name. Let's go outside. Okay, so, it was like that. It was cool for a second. Wait, look again. No. But Escape from the Deep meant a lot to us because, as Alex mentioned, the main character in it was somebody who was very closely associated with this program. Clay and Annie, his bride, and his family were close to Dan and Tom and Nathan and me. And Clay came to this class many years, even as his health was declining. Clay was a submariner, and we'll get into the book here in a second, but I'll tell you one quick Clay story. When Clay was first becoming sick, he was at the VA hospital in Denver, and I went down to visit him at the hospital, and I went up and finally found what floor he was on, and the general idea where his room was, but I still wasn't totally sure. And until I came to this door that had newspaper articles from top to bottom about him. So I opened the door, and he was sitting in there. He got this big grin on his face when he saw me, and I went in and I said, what the hell's with all the newspaper articles? And he says, well, I damn sure want to know. I damn sure want those nurses to know just who they're taking care of in this room. Attaboy, Clay. That's Clay, right?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
That was Clay Decker, one of the great guys. Escape from the Deep now gets Alex into the Pacific.
Right.
Right, finally.
in hot water, too. The interesting about Clay Decker is that I didn't get to meet Clay Decker. I think I began my research. How did I first know about Clay Decker? I came on a radio show with you,
me.
and I said, and you said to me, what are you doing next? And I said, the Tang.
Right.
And you said, oh,
yeah,
I know a guy from the Tang.
Yeah.
And it was Clay Decker, which is great because I never got to meet Clay Decker. Clay Decker was one of actually 5 really quite amazing Americans, and believe it or not, only 5 Americans have ever escaped from a submerged submarine and lived to tell the tale. And they were 5 Americans from the USS Tang, which actually unbelievably, fantastically for me as a storyteller, but unbelievably and tragically for them, fired its 24th torpedo on its 5th patrol as the most decorated, the most lethal U.S. submarine in history. And this torpedo went out and boomeranged and came back, and they sank themselves. And Clay Decker was actually at his post and looked to one side and saw his buddies high-fiving. As this torpedo went out, it was the last torpedo. The 23rd torpedo had hit a Japanese freighter, and so the Japanese were out of the way. Everybody knew that once you'd fired all your torpedoes on a U.S. submarine, you hightailed it as fast as you could back to San Francisco. And literally, Clay Decker turned around and he saw his friends high-fiving as this last 24th torpedo went out. Somebody shouted out 090, which is the course for San Francisco, on the way back. And the torpedo was timed, I think, for 42 seconds. So after about 22 seconds, on the bridge of the Tang, which was on the surface at the time, the captain and others were watching through binoculars. One guy called Bill Liebold, who's alive today and is the only survivor from the Tang, I should say, was looking through binoculars, and he saw the phosphorescent wake of the torpedo, and it broached, which meant that it sort of broached like that, like a porpoise. And he turned to the Captain O'Kane, Medal of Honor recipient, and said, "There's something wrong, you know?" And the captain looked through his binoculars. It's pitch black, and he sees the phosphorescent wake start to turn, and he realizes 24, 25 seconds gone that this torpedo is now coming back towards them. And they did everything they could to evade, everything they possibly could, but unfortunately the torpedo, 39, 40, 41, boom, and half of the crew were killed instantly on impact, and out of 89 men, around 50 were killed instantly, and the others were, several were thrown from the bridge, including O'Kane, who survived, Liebold, who's the only survivor to this day, and a few others. And Decker and 40 other people, 40 other men, were stuck inside the submarine after the torpedo hit. And of those 40, 5 made history by escaping from a submarine that was 180 feet down and rising to the surface up a knotted rope. Every 10 feet there was a knot, and they managed to make history as the only Americans before and since to get out of a sunken sub and live.
A couple of things about this story that I was taken with when I read it the first time. As men are in this situation, 180 feet down, many of them are weighing their fear of surviving the escape, or I'll just stay here. And many of them make the choice that they're too terrified to try the escape, and they go to their cots and lay down. They go to their rooms and refuse to try.
Yeah. The torpedo hit about 2:30 in the morning, and at 8 o'clock, about 8 o'clock, the survivors were picked up by the Japanese. The in-between hours, the 6 hours in between, were the most claustrophobic, horrific, nerve-jangling that I've ever studied in combat. What happened was that the 40 men had to make their way towards a forward torpedo room. Then they had to get into a small capsule, an escape chamber, where they had to equalize the pressure inside that chamber with that of the water outside, which meant that they were squeezed in together while being depth charged, by the way, by the Japanese, squeezed together so that literally they could smell the other man's fear. It's about 120 degrees, and the temperature's rising all the time. The oxygen is running out. Obviously, they're underwater. There are at least 3 fires sucking up oxygen and heating up the submarine as if it's a pressure cooker. And they have to get into an escape chamber, 6 of them, and equalize the pressure. And the way that was done was that they let in cold water from the outside, and it came in and it rose, in Decker's case, almost up to, because he wasn't too tall, almost up to his chin. It was very, very cold water. You know, you go from 120 degrees to very cold water. A lot of them had, the first 2 escape attempts failed because the guys broke. They couldn't take the pressure, they couldn't take the temperature. They were also too afraid. But eventually, a party, including Decker, could withstand the cold and the pressure, which made their eardrums burst, which made their noses bleed, and it's about 8 times the pressure you're feeling right now in this room. Anybody who has been diving will know exactly what I'm talking about. I can't describe it very well because I've not been at 180 feet down, but it's an enormous amount of pressure, And they managed to withstand that pressure, open a hatch into that led out of the submarine, and then I say buoy, you say buoy, don't you? Yeah. And that
We say it the right way, buoy.
I know, exactly. And that was attached to a rope, and the buoy went straight to the surface, 180 feet, and I got it right, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
And every 10 feet, my wife would be very proud.
Yeah.
You know, I've only just started saying yard rather than garden. And garbage. I didn't put the garbage out yesterday. It was the rubbish. But anyway. Anyway, 180 feet up, and every 10 feet there's a knot on the rope. It's pitch black. Many of these guys are wounded. They've endured terrible conditions and heat and fear and many other factors. And they had to climb up this rope and stop at every knot. So if you had the steely nerve to survive in the first place, get to the forward torpedo room, withstand the equalization of the pressure without cracking, and many of them did, then you had to stand a chance of living, climb up this rope. Now, if you went up too quickly, you got what was called the bends. If you went up too slowly, you drowned. You had between 2 and 3 minutes to get to the surface, they estimated. Every knot going up 180 feet, you stopped for about 5 or 10 seconds so that you wouldn't get the bend, so that the air in your lungs would equalize. If you went up too quickly, basically, it would be like air in your lungs expands very, very quickly, and your lungs explode. And in fact, Clay Decker's, one of Clay Decker's fellow submariners, that's exactly what happened to him. He went up too fast and was where you are from me when he came to the surface, and his lungs had exploded. So you had to stop at every knot. And unbelievably, if you didn't stop at the last knot, the very last one, 10 feet from the surface, and now you're within touching distance of life, really that close, and the light is coming down, you can see the sun. It's 8 o'clock in the morning up there. You can see the sun. You've gone through hell for 6 hours, and you are so close to life. That knot was the most important knot. If you didn't stop at that one, that would be the most damage would be done to your lungs as you came up. And Decker almost didn't stop at that knot and remembered just in time and got to the surface. And the guy that came up behind him, who was called Bill Ballinger, who was chief of the boat, who he respected enormously, he'd forgotten at some point coming up to stop each knot, and his lungs exploded. And Decker tried to reach out for him, couldn't get to him because the currents were so strong, and watched him float away, taken by the current.
And now you've survived all this. You're one of the 5 that have survived, and the Japanese are waiting for you.
Yeah.
And on their ship are the survivors of the freighter you have sunk the night before.
Yeah.
And they know you're the guys.
Yeah.
And that's your welcoming party. After all of that, that's who's waiting for you.
Yeah, and they were very, very badly burnt, the Japanese that were fished out of the water that they'd sunk. O'Kane aimed his torpedoes. He was a very unsettling character to write about. He was probably the most aggressive, one of the most aggressive submarine captains of the Second World War, and there were many very aggressive submarine captains. They were undersea hunters, literally. They took their job very seriously, and they were about hunting and killing as many Japanese as they could.
Yeah.
Whether that, in some cases, was troop ships, hospital ships, it was called unrestricted warfare.
In fact, there was some discussion about the last torpedo, wasn't there? About, am I mistaking that for something else? Was there one, maybe it wasn't on the Tang, was there earlier in his career?
Yeah, in the Wahoo.
Okay, all right, that's what I'm thinking of.
Anyway, so they are pulled out by the Japanese, and they're put on the deck of a Japanese patrol boat, and also on the deck are a couple of dozen very badly burnt Japanese survivors of the previous night's Holocaust, literally. And the Japanese took instant revenge. They stubbed cigarettes out on them, beat them. One guy, they performed mock executions. One guy, Floyd Cavalier, up until Friday, there were 2 survivors from the greatest U.S. submarine in history, the Tang. And Floyd Cavalier, who I interviewed in Oregon, died on Friday, leaving just one, Bill Liebold. So there's only one guy. You were talking earlier about this generation passing on, and so there's just one guy left now from those lucky few. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they were taken into what was called the torture farm of Funa. If any of you read that book Unbroken about Louis Zamperini,
Yeah.
hugely successful right now. Louis Zamperini was in the same place, in Afuna.
Yeah.
And Afuna was basically a place where it's a top secret naval intelligence base where the Japanese took submariners and they tortured them to try and find out what they could about American submarine warfare. Because what really defeated the Japanese, some submarine veterans will argue, was the amazing success of US subs in the Pacific. The Japanese empire was slowly reduced through island hopping, through the sacrifice of many, many thousands of American lives in absolutely barbaric combat. The war against the Japanese in the Second World War, the reason why I will not revisit it for quite a while is because it was absolutely barbaric. There were no prisoners taken really that often on either side. Certainly the Japanese didn't surrender. And it was a race war. Both sides were encouraged to hate the other with a vengeance. The propaganda campaign in this country was absolutely overwhelming. Almost every American ended up loathing the Japanese on very basic racial reasons. And unfortunately, well, let me tell you this story, and this will explain what I'm talking about. I went to a Burger King in Sarasota, Florida, with a survivor from the Sculpin. There were about 122 submarine POWs. So you think about that. These are guys that became prisoners of the Japanese that had been in submarines. So that either their submarine was boarded by the Japanese or they went into the water when it sank. Very few guys lived from a submarine.
Right.
This guy had lived and went and spent 6 months in Afuna, where Decker and the rest went. And I sat in a burger joint on a Sunday with him, and he prayed for 5 minutes, and it was a long, long prayer. I was like, dude, come on, man, I'm hungry, you know?
My Whopper's getting cold here, pal. Come on.
And I said, why do you pray? I mean, we're in Burger King. I wasn't, you know,
right.
But I said, it's Burger King, man. You know, it's like, it's a burger. You know.
Right.
He said, every meal I've ever eaten since I was a prisoner of the Japanese, I've prayed and said the Lord's Prayer before every single meal. He hated the Japanese with an amazing venom, even over 60 years later, because of what was done to him by the Japanese in POW camps, and by what the Japanese did to many, many American POWs. They did not conform to the Geneva Convention. Lyle Bauk and the guys I talked about earlier in Germany, the Germans did obey, to some extent, the Geneva Conventions. They did treat American POWs with a certain amount of respect. They fed them. They didn't torture them. They didn't humiliate them. They didn't psychologically scar them for the rest of their lives, ritually. And I think one of the things that some of the POWs, the American POWs that were so unlucky to have been prisoners of the Japanese, some of them resented most was the way it was sort of enjoyed.
Yeah.
The way it became sort of ritualistic and was enjoyed, and the way that they became the victims of sadists.
Yes.
I think that's something that really struck me about the Pacific.
And Pappy Boynton was there as well.
Yeah, Pappy Boynton, the Marine pilot. Baba Black Sheep.
Clay was proud of that.
Yeah, definitely. But Clay Decker, who you talked about, there's a fantastic photograph which I couldn't include in the book in time.
Oh, yeah.
Which is taken from it's a San Francisco Chronicle, and I think it's September of 1945, and it shows Clay Decker
Front row.
with his wife.
Oh,
You haven't seen this one? I haven't told you this
No,
one.
I haven't
This is
seen
a good one. A bunch of American POWs landed in the naval base in San Francisco. What is it? Alameda? Is it Alameda?
Treasure Island.
Yeah. They came back and they landed, and the local press were there to take photographs, and the headlines were, POWs, Japanese POWs arrived back to their loved ones and families. And it was a little bit like the Vietnam scenes where you see the families running across the runway towards the released POWs. And Clay Decker was there, and a San Francisco Chronicle photographer took a picture of Clay Decker embracing his wife and holding his 2-year-old son at the same time. Now, you know the end of the story, but the story is that no one came back from a submarine when it was sunk. His wife had remarried while he was in a POW camp. So either when they got in the cab going home or at some point later, she said, by the way, I'm glad that you're here, but by the way, I remarried. and I spent the insurance policy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then he gained custody of his son came to Colorado, Denver, started a new life.
Yep.
Met Annie in a local church, was it? I think it was a church.
It was a church, right? Yeah.
Was it a church?
Yeah.
And then he started a rubbish business, garbage business, rubbish business. And did very, very well.
Did very well.
Very well, yeah. And then he met you guys.
Just one of the great guys.
Yeah.
So Escape from the Deep is, of Alex's stories here, is the one that introduces his readers to this notion of internment and of the conditions in the Japanese POW camp and the tremendous courage that it took in the decisions that were made down 180 feet down by guys on whether or not they were going to try to escape from that. I remember when the Russian sub went down, the Murmansk, right?
Yeah.
Clay was on like the
He was
NBC
interviewed at
News.
USA Today.
Oh yeah, they were all calling Clay to
Yeah.
ask him about surviving a sub, and every time I'd see him, I was on with Brokaw last night. Yeah, okay, Clay.
Yeah.
It was great.
I think what
I miss him a lot.
amazed me about that story was that, and I mentioned this in at the World War II Museum down in New Orleans.
Yeah.
In front of actually there were a few vets from World War II, submarine vets.
Okay.
And I said that, in a way, that the way I felt about writing about these guys was that it was a love story. The 9 guys, 7 of the 9 men, and think about this, the average age on the submarine was like 20, 21, maybe at most. 9 guys out of 89 live. Okay, 7 of them were married, with either kids on the way or with one's wife was pregnant. She didn't wait either, but they were married. And O'Kane, the captain, Liebold, who's the last survivor, he was married. Decker was married, obviously.
Yeah.
What they said was that the reason why they lived was because they had a reason to live, and the thing that motivated them was to see their wife and their kids again. And they said that the young guys that weren't married, the 18 super strong, balls out, I can take on Hitler and kill him in a second.
Right.
The arrogant BSers, if you like, those guys didn't live. It was the guys who were married, who had kids, that gave everything because they wanted to see them again. So that was a nice moral. It was
it's a great book. If you've not read Escape from the Deep, I'll read them all. Okay, so now we're down to the most recent book, the book that came out last year, The Envoy, which I will tell you that when I started it on a Friday night, I did not put it down until I finished it Sunday afternoon. Once I started this story, which has nothing to do with American or British veterans, or our forces, but has to do with a remarkable man that maybe you've heard the name, but I guarantee you had no sense of his significance in history, a gentleman named Raoul Wallenberg. And this is the story of a man who single-handedly saved more Jews from the Nazis than did Schindler or did the others that you've heard, but a story that had not been told in the detail that Alex has told the story. From having dinner with him tonight and from the other times that I've talked to him, I get a sense that I know when he started this project and we talked about it, how excited he was about it. And I think after a couple of years of research and working on this and being disgusted by things you were hearing and finding out and discovering, and I'm not so sure that it ended up being your favorite of your children.
No, I have very, very, very conflicted feelings about this book, and I also, I think I finally started to grow up a little bit when I wrote this book. There were things about humanity that I didn't want to accept. Things about how destructive we are as a race, how utterly destructive we can be, that I didn't really want to take on board to the extent that I had to. But the reason why I started to write the book was because I wanted I was fascinated by the idea of why in January of 1945 did 22,000 of Jack's mates, buddies, die in Europe alone in 1 month. 22,000, mostly working class Americans, died over 3,000 miles away from here. For what? And why did they have to die? And my answer to that would be that they stopped the greatest evil of modern times. And those who were lucky enough, like Jack and other guys from the 45th Infantry Division who liberated Dachau concentration camp, they saw with their own eyes why so many GIs died, to stop the Holocaust. There were 9 million Jews in Europe in 1942. There were 3 million in 1945. In the summer of 1944, in 6 weeks, over 500,000 men, women, and children in Hungary were killed in Auschwitz at a rate of 2 per second. This is the most destructive, the most violent chapter of the Holocaust, and it's only months from the end of the war. We knew about Auschwitz in 1942. It's definitely by 1943. Allied planes had photographed the crematoria. The Holocaust is about the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. The only thing that Hitler succeeded in, when you think about it, was killing over 6 million Jews, let alone countless homosexuals, Catholic priests, gypsies, wiped out, even before America was involved in the Second World War, all of the mentally handicapped in Germany. They were the ones that they experimented on to make sure they could kill in sufficient numbers so that when it came to the Jews, they could get rid of them as quickly as possible. There was only one thing that he succeeded at, and that was the destruction of the Jewish race. And when you talk about the Second World War, unless you understand what the Holocaust was about, you don't understand diddly squat about the Second World War. Because the Second World War was a race war. It was waged, its only rationale from the Nazi point of view was to destroy the Jewish race. It's the only thing that logically you can pursue through is the insanity of mass murder of the Jewish race.
So 1945, the world is shrinking for the Germans. Adolf Eichmann is in Hungary, and he is determined that he is going to kill as many Jews as he can before this war ends. And his goal becomes to kill all of the Jews of Hungary, and he's in Budapest, and it's in this environment that this ambassador, Raoul Wallenberg, shows up.
Right.
Guy shows up, he's in a suit. I mean, he looks like any kind of businessman, right?
Right. No,
Takes a train.
Takes a train from Berlin. Swedish. Sweden was neutral in the Second World War. He's a 32-year-old, well-traveled, very smart young aristocrat. Belonged to the richest family in Sweden, the Wallenbergs, who still own over 50% of private industry in Sweden, if you can believe it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely. And he wanted to prove himself. And he went to, as a neutral diplomat, he went to Hungary, Budapest, in July of 1944, unfortunately too late to save 500,000 of the 800,000 Jews in Hungary, but not too late to go to the embassy and devise many, many very, very clever strategies and diplomatic ruses to try and protect these last Jews of Europe, the last Jews that hadn't been sent to Auschwitz. Wallenberg's been written about several times. There've been quite a lot written about him. And what I wanted to do was to interview people who were saved by him, because I'm very aware that just as there are now no D-Day survivors from the Bedford Boys, in your lifetimes, those of you who are the students here, all of those who fought in the Second World War will pass away. And importantly, not just those who fought, but those who survived the Holocaust will have passed away. So I was very aware of time with this. And I wanted to tell the story of Wallenberg from the point of view of those people who were saved. He managed basically by handing out what were called Schutzpasses, safe passages, to Jews in Budapest. He managed to save, unbelievably, around about 100,000 lives, people say. Actually, he's mentioned in the Guinness Book of Records as the single human being in history who saved more lives than any other. There are only two honorary Americans, Winston Churchill, for obvious reasons. I'm very happy about that. The only other honorary American is Raoul Wallenberg, and Reagan made him an honorary American in 1981 in recognition of his incredible courage and smarts during this period of the Second World War.
So he's handing out these passes, which they're printing up at his office. They're in there,
Thousands.
They're printing them as fast as they can. They don't mean anything. I'm telling Alex's story like I wrote it. They don't mean anything, but they're enough to trick the guards and the younger Germans who are herding the Jews onto the trains to take them off to Auschwitz. They're enough to give them some thought that, okay, they've got this diplomatic immunity, and they kick them out of the line. I mean, it's a ruse, really.
Yeah.
And so then once they're freed, once they're let go, Wallenberg's putting them in safe houses, basically, wherever they can get as many as they can get, until the next time they're rounded up. And then we go through the drill again. But the amazing thing about this man Wallenberg is he's not doing it from the office. He's going down to the train station and thrusting himself through guards and getting to the front of the train and just handing out passes and telling the guards, stop this. These are protected. This guy's courage.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he was a different kind of war hero, you know?
Yeah.
And what's amazing to me was that if you think about the 100,000 people that were alive in Budapest, the 100,000 Jews that were alive when the Soviets finally arrived and liberated Budapest in January of 1945, those 100,000 people are now 1 million today, which is amazing when you think about it. When you think about all the lives that were destroyed, the potential lives that were destroyed during the Holocaust, how many million would that be?
Sure.
If 6 million were killed then, you know, how many would that have been today? Well, here you have 100,000 that are 1 million. So there's a sort of one man can make a difference. It sounds very cliched what I'm saying, but you know, one person can make a difference. And he did it. And
So you've got to read this book. The Envoy is an amazing book, and just when he finally gets through with the Germans, then the Arrow Cross shows up, and it, in many regards, is a bit worse, even if it could be worse. I mean, just the random killing on the streets, and Budapest just kind of sinks into anarchy almost.
Yeah, I mean, there aren't many places that are, except inside perhaps Auschwitz, but in terms of cities, apparently civilized places, Budapest in January of 1945 was about as hellish as you can get. Anyway, I interviewed several people who are alive today because of Wallenberg, and one one of the there was a young couple. I don't want to go on too long about this, but I'll tell you one story about this one couple that will give you a feeling for why emotionally this involved me. This story. I met Alice Breuer in Stockholm 2 years ago, and she was saved twice by Wallenberg. The first time she was almost beaten to death by the Gestapo and SS in July of 1944, and was rescued from the prison because her husband managed to get Schutzpasses from Wallenberg. She was saved the second time by Wallenberg when she stood in her underwear along the banks of the Danube River, tied to several other people in front of the guns of the Arrow Cross, who were the Hungarian fascists. And they would tie people together so they wouldn't waste bullets. They'd shoot one of every three, and because they were tied together, they would fall into the Danube, which was very icy, and they would die. And she was tied to other people, and Erwin, her husband, was there, and Wallenberg amazingly turned up just as they were about to be shot, took a megaphone out and shouted out, "You cannot touch those Jews. Those are my Jews. I own those Jews. You have no right to kill those Jews. If you do," one guy stood alone in the street at dawn, "if you kill those Jews, you'll die. I will make sure that you hang as a war criminal." And she said to me when I interviewed her in Stockholm, she said, "That was the second time that he saved my life." And she said, I'm an atheist, but at that moment I thought that he was God. So Alice Breuer is alive today. She managed to survive the Holocaust, obviously. And her young husband, Erwin Koranyi, he's also alive. And he lives in Toronto. And I interviewed her in the summer in Stockholm. And she handed me this book and said, "You have to read this." And I said, "Who's it by?" And she said, it's written by my husband, Erwin. And I said, "Oh, wow." And then she said, "Oh, by the way, you also have to go and see him. He's alive." I didn't realize that he was alive. So 6 months later, I drive up in February to Toronto, and I interviewed Erwin. And they got divorced after the war. It's not a happy ever after story in that sense, but she lost all of her family in the Holocaust. They were all sent to Auschwitz. And most of his family survived. And she psychologically could not be with that man, although she loved him to death, because she couldn't deal with the fact that his family was alive and hers wasn't. So every birthday, every family get-together, imagine no one from her family lived. And most of his family did. So it was very sad, because there were two people that loved each other immensely.
Still do.
And still do.
Still do.
But she just couldn't be with him because of what was done to her.
So I'll cut to the chase, because now you really want to buy the book. I know you do. You're going to stop at Barnes & Noble on your way home, and you're going to get the book. So cut to the chase. Raoul Wallenberg. Hey, let's have a parade, right? I mean, this hero of World War II, let's celebrate him, vanishes.
Yeah, he was